Welcome to Attune to Your Alchemy, a podcast for women who want to step into their divine feminine, embody their sacred pleasure, and be in community with other women who are living their soul's purpose. I'm your host, Ellie McMillan, a priestess with the 13 Moon Mystery School and founder of the online community, the Matriarch Collective. I have the privilege of working with women who want to reconnect to their souls and remember what it's like to be in their sacredness. Together, we are going to explore the wilds of intimacy, pleasure, feminine energetics, and the alchemy of our everyday lives. This is a sacred place for you to reclaim your magic and embrace the power of the divine. Come with me. Welcome back to the podcast, everyone. I'm so excited today to have Dr. Robyn with me to talk about hormones. And before we started, actually, we were like, okay, what are we going to narrow this down to? Because I feel like this is many different conversations that we're going to have moving forward. And I know for me, having you in my life has been so wonderful to learn what is going on internally for me. What is happening here? And so I'm excited to dive into that. But first, Dr. Robyn, hi.
Hi.
Welcome to the podcast.
Yeah. I'm happy to be here.
I want you to tell me a little bit about how you came to where you are today to become the naturopath that works with female hormones, especially.
Yeah, I took probably the most roundabout route that you could to become a naturopathic doctor. I knew in high school or so that I wanted to work in the environmental field and environmental education. That was kind of my big goal. So I had done some education at the local technical school here to do fish, wildlife, and recreation was the first diploma. I always joke that I was this hippie tree hugger, but really I was going out doing environmental restoration work and studying birds down in Puerto Rico and did some really cool stuff. But
wow,
working for nonprofits doesn't really pay the bills, especially back then. That was the early 2000s. So I had a love of doing yoga and I thought, okay, I'm going to do my teacher training. So dove into a 200-hour teacher training with the intent of maybe I'll teach a class a week or just deepen my own practice. And it was probably around 2003 then when yoga was really just starting to take off in Vancouver. Lululemon was just becoming the thing. And so I went from teaching, one casual class a week to getting phone calls all the time. Hey, I hear you teach. Can you come teach at my studio? Which would never happen nowadays. Yeah. And then my contract ended at the nonprofit and I was teaching a lot of yoga and I was like, hey, I think I'm just going to do this for a couple months of summertime, take it pretty easy. And that quickly transitioned into full-time work, which quickly transitioned into hey, I think I'm going to open a yoga studio.
Which is how I met you.
Which is how we met, exactly. Ellie came to my yoga classes many, many years ago. And yeah, teaching yoga was lovely, but I still do teach yoga and I lead yoga teacher trainings now, which is wonderful. But there was always this need to I want to go deeper, and people would come in I've got some back pain or I've got this going on and be oh, these poses would be good, but I didn't really have that much else to be able to share with them other than referrals to practitioners that I knew. So I dove into becoming a doula and I started supporting women through their birthing journeys or families through the birthing journeys. And I really loved that combo. And then when I was leading a retreat, I had a student that was halfway through the naturopathic program that was hey, I'm doing this. Never even heard of this. It sounds interesting. At the time, I was vegetarian, but I was eating very well. And I was probably doing 20 to 25 yoga classes a week, but I was tired all the time and went to my normal medical doctor with this concern. And she basically walked out the door saying well, just eat better and do more exercise. And I'm you didn't even ask me anything, right? Which I think is a very common experience with women in their 20s to 40s, 50s, which I'm going to dive into a lot more through this talk because this is the population I work with now because of this disempowering nature that I think the medical society kind of gives us often. But anyways, I know this is a bit of a long story, but that basically led me to go to the naturopathic school. There's two schools in Canada. One's in New Westminster, one's out in Ontario. So I went to the one here in in New Westminster, in like an hour-long visit, when they asked me all these sort of questions, they were able to be like, hey, you're on birth control pills and that kind of blocks vitamin B6 absorption. You know, you could go off the pill or you could just add in B6. So I added in this simple nutrient, and within a week, it was like a light bulb turned on. I was like, oh my God, like I'm back to being me. I've got energy back. So it just blew me away that all it took was somebody listening to my story and putting some puzzle pieces together that really helped me move forwards. And yeah, that was the thing. I was just like, I want to do this. This is the key piece. And the coolest part, I think, for me, because I did go back to school when I was 30, in the meantime, while I was doing yoga, I got an environmental geography degree, and then got accepted into the naturopathic program with a conditional acceptance. You have to have pre-med, and I had an arts degree. So I had to do a crazy year of upgrading to basically a pre-med equivalent to get my acceptance into the program. But going through the interview process to get in was like taking all these puzzle pieces and bringing them together. And I realized for me, the huge central point was connection. And like I had wanted to do environmental education because I wanted people to connect with nature and help people connect with that. And with yoga, it was like about connecting back to their breath and their bodies. And I mean, definitely that with the doula work. And then naturopathic medicine is really about connecting to, you know, our story within, what's going on in our body, to the healing power of nature. So it just all came together. And yeah, was a crazy ride going through school. Made it through somehow with a lot of adrenal fatigue and cortisol, which we're going to talk about today as well. So that's I've lived that firsthand. And yeah, now I've been in practice. This year will be my 10th year since I graduated. So
wow, really?
Patients for 10 years plus 2 years, we kind of do like a residency within the school program. So been seeing patients for 12 years.
Wow.
It's crazy. Yeah, I know.
I can't believe it's been that long. It's been that long.
It's been that long. Yeah. Yeah. Because I think we met back in 2009 as well.
You're right. That's around the year that we did meet. Yes, it is. Good memory. Yeah. I walked into one of Robyn's yoga. Actually, I walked into Robyn's yoga studio because I heard that yoga was good for allergies. I have not heard that since.
Yeah, no. Totally. Align your chakras, get rid of your allergies.
Yeah, exactly. That's exactly. It was something to do with the breathing. Anyways, I went to a yoga class at your yoga studio and absolutely fell in love. My second yoga class or third yoga class was with you. And I tell all of my beginner students this, the joke of like, it was core yoga. And I thought that meant basic.
Oh, no.
It did not.
No,
it did not at all mean basic yoga. And then I signed up for the
yoga.
Yeah. Then I signed up for the 30-day yoga challenge, and then I signed up for my yoga teacher training. So I really have you to thank for creating that lovely space so that people like me could blindly find our way in there. I actually thought that my love at the time was going to come with me, and she dropped me off at the door and was like, "Hey, bye." And I was like, "Aren't you coming?" I was like, no. So yeah, there was a few things that got me to where we are today.
Yeah.
As you were speaking, I was thinking about, because when I started working with you in this realm only a few years ago, I realized I had never seen a naturopath before. I obviously knew that you were becoming a naturopath and watched your journey, but I actually didn't know what you did. Like what do naturopaths do, for anybody who doesn't know that already?
Yeah, it's a great question, and one that I think more and more people are getting to know what we do, which is great. It feels good as a professional in the profession that people are knowing it, but there's still absolutely the people that think that we're kind of witch doctors and we're super woo-woo. And I remember one of my first patients actually at the yoga studio, she sent her husband to see me and I gave him a tincture, which is a botanical extraction of plants. It's really the foundation of modern pharmaceutical medicine. And the woman came into a yoga class the week later and she's like, "Oh, that potion you gave my husband worked really well." I'm like, and that's why people think we're witch doctors.
A potion?
Cute, but it's a tincture and
it is magical in the end. Yeah, okay.
Totally. And I do like, as much as I'm a very evidence-based practitioner, I'm always reading medical literature and then seeing how we can apply that to, nature and more natural approaches. But I think more and more I've really stepped into embracing like this lineage of healers that have come before me. And like, previous generations, they were the midwives and the elders and the sorcerers and the herbalists. And I mean, even traditional medical doctors going in and doing like home visits, they would actually know the family and spend time with patients instead of this modern model of 5 minutes. So that's a little side note, but really my spiel on naturopathic medicine, especially here in BC, is we're highly regulated. We fall under a College of Naturopathic Physicians in BC. That college is changing in a few months because of the college amalgamations that are happening under the Healthcare Act right now. But anyways, we are governed by a college at the provincial governmental level. And in order to practice here in our province, we have to have a four-year pre-med or pre-med equivalent and a 4-year medical school program. We sit 2 levels of board exams, the last one being 4 days long, plus a provincial in-person exam to get our licensure. So I always encourage people, if they are going to see a naturopath, to see one that calls themselves a naturopathic doctor, because there really is a difference between ours. The doctor is a reserved title in BC, so I would be legally responsible if I was using the term doctor without having my license. But there are a few other provinces and definitely a few other states out there that still are unregulated. So somebody could take a 10-week, 15, 16-week online course, be like, I'm a naturopath.
Wow.
It's pretty hard to compare that to our 8 years of education that we bring to the table. So, and then where we're really different than family doctors, because we're all considered primary care physicians, at least at this point under the Healthcare Act. A medical doctor's whole approach and whole training is to treat your symptoms, which 100% there's a time and place. If you got a broken arm, you want to treat that symptom. Like, sure, yes, I know the logistics of setting an arm if it's broken. Am I going to do it? No. And especially if we're close to the city, go to the hospital and see somebody that does that constantly.
Yes.
But my role is more of treating the root cause and treating the whole person. And that's where we really thrive in working with chronic conditions, with people, as I mentioned before, I work a lot with the 20 to 40-year-old age range, where I find a lot of women will go in saying, hey, I'm not feeling well. And their doctor's like, well, you look well. Do you want to be on antidepressants? Or like, maybe don't eat fatty food, or just something that's so disempowering. Yet they know their bodies and they know something's wrong. And often through investigation, we do find that something is wrong and they can be supported.
I think you're touching on something really important here, is that for me, the biggest difference, I avoided the medical system, the allopathic medical system, for a long time, and just did my own research to try to find, and spoke to people and tried to find, even before like coming to you, it would have just shortcutted things. But I also took a little bit of a hard route. I took the back door, and it was so disempowering to go to those appointments that I was like, it's not even worth my time.
No,
because I know what the answer is going to be. And the answer is going to be, here's a prescription to mask that symptom.
Yeah.
And I want to know there's something deeper going on. And so the biggest thing for me in working with a naturopath, and for anyone out there who's thinking about working with a naturopath, is that it has become a partner in healthcare. That's what I really find, especially when I work with you. I can come to you and say, I suspect this is going on. Can we figure this out? Like, what do you think is happening here? And instead of it being, okay, well, here's a supplement to mask this, you in general, I find, really go to, okay, I've done some research on this, we've done this is where I want to come from. And it feels like a partnership instead of, and there are times in our life where we just need somebody to do the thing for us, like to reset our arm. That's needed.
Yeah.
And you probably have to look at a bunch of other things after that, like calcium and healing in general, and
100%.
the stress in your body for that to heal it, nicely. Yeah. And that's the difference for me in partnership. And that's what I really love about working with naturopaths, but really what I love about working with you. So
thank you so much.
Wonderful.
Yeah, that makes my heart happy, because that's exactly what I want to do and be. And I don't see it as a top-down sort of thing. I see it as like a very collaborative relationship, and like all my patients have the answers, like whether it's that they know it, and often I'm asking the question, well, what do you think's going on? And not in terms of like, oh, I'm trying not to like treat you, but often people be like, what, I actually feel like it's this, or this is the root of it. And usually they're right. But also to, empower you, because it's your body, you know it best. And if we don't listen to that and have the chance to sit down, like the gift in sitting down for an hour and listening to a whole story, if our allopathic medical system could do that, people would have a very, very different experience. But unfortunately, the system isn't set up for that. I think there's some good movement in that direction. But it's like, I need that hour to ask all the questions and to do the investigation. And from that, I've been able to pick up things. I mean, not as a huge brag, but I've picked up several tumors that have been missed by doctors just because I've had the time to be able to ask questions over and over, or see them on repeated basis on quite a condensed timeline to be able to see change over time. Be like, this needs further investigation, and really advocate for that person too. Definitely more proactive healthcare than reactive healthcare.
And what I'm really hearing from you right now is this whole, like, we know when we're given permission with a different healthcare practitioner to actually tune into ourselves, that becomes a very different form of healthcare for us as well.
Yeah.
Because we're starting to think about, oh, this feels a little bit off. This feels a little bit off. Because how many women, as we move into this conversation about hormones, how many women just walk around going, oh, my hair's just falling out. I'm 40.
Yeah. I'm
Oh,
perimenopausal.
yeah, I'm perimenopausal. I'm 40. Oh, I've had, terrible, terrible, terrible cycle cramps and PMS. I'm just a woman. This is who I am.
Yeah.
So let's talk a little bit about what you're seeing right now. I think, especially in your practice with cortisol imbalances.
Yeah.
With the thing that every woman is every woman is walking around with right now.
Totally. I would say like every single person's walking around with this. And it's interesting to see the evolution over the last 10 years of my practice, where there's always been a level of stress. It's absolutely the most common concern that everyone comes in with, like stress, fatigue, sleep stuff, hormone stuff. Everybody's got some level of it. But I mean, of course, we all talk about it as COVID, this term unprecedented, all of a sudden is like thrown around like crazy. Like everyone had this level of stress. That level of stress is just maintained as high. And if anything, it's gone up more, both with, I don't have to go over it, but like everything that's going on in daily life, rent, mortgages, blah, 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 food costs. But what I'm seeing more and more is just this like existential level of stress. Like people can't quite put their finger on it, but they just know that there's this higher level of stress than ever before. So yes, we can have that in our mind. And often we think about our stress hormones as like something that's being produced in the mind. And the mind it's influenced by those neurotransmitters. But, an interesting side fact, serotonin, which is our happy neurotransmitter, 70 to 80% of that is actually created in our digestive tract. It's not being created in your brain. So these neurotransmitters, these hormones are working throughout our entire body. So cortisol is our big stress hormone. And the story that I always tell about cortisol, because everything to me is an analogy. This is my arts background going into science. So I've got
here's the yoga teacher weaving of the theme.
That's right, exactly. So when we look at cortisol, it's probably one of our oldest hormones in our bodies, taking us back to being a caveman, let's say, or cave person. We'd be happily cooking dinner over a campfire, and all of a sudden a saber-toothed tiger would jump out and try and eat us. So cortisol's job was to spike when cortisol in turn would have an activity or an effect, I should say, on insulin. Insulin would then release a bunch of blood sugar out into the body to power up our arms and our legs, and we would be able to run away. Back then, two scenarios would generally play out. The first one is you get eaten and you wouldn't have to worry about things anymore. The second one is you find a tree or a cave and you'd be safe for a few days, and then saber-toothed or a woolly mammoth or something would come out, or all of a sudden we're going into a famine, or whatever it is, right? So when we look at the lasting effect of cortisol in our body, it's anywhere between 36 to 72 hours at a time. So unless we're getting that day and a half to 2-3 days of stress-free time, that cortisol is overlapping again and again and again. And most of us are in that cortisol hamster wheel right now. Perfect example of this is when we work our butts off to go on holidays. We're stressed and stressed and stressed. We get on that plane. The next day we're like, oh, beautiful Hawaii. I'm having my Mai Tai on the beach. And then the next day you get sick. It's just because the more stressed we are, the more our immune system is depressed. And then when we actually have that time to let our immune system or cortisol chill out, then our immune system overreacts. And unless we're getting a vacation that's, 2 weeks long, we've got the stress of getting there, the stress of having a cold. We might get a couple of days of feeling good, and then we start to get stressed about going home. And we really don't get these resets anymore, right? So the body then has to start making adaptations to the cortisol. Cortisol left unopposed will start to kind of fry your brain cells a little bit. So the body has to buffer and change to be able to kind of support that higher level of cortisol. So it does that by drawing away from different hormones, which we're going to dig into in a sec. I'll layer into that. But it also starts to dysregulate your energy a little bit throughout the day. And this is where we really, really differ from a medical doctor. If you do a Google search on adrenal insufficiency, you'll have all these things being like, it is a thing, and all these things being like, it's not a thing. This is just a big hocus pocus sort of idea. But it's really that according to the allopathic system and based on the lab testing, because a lot of their diagnoses are based on labs, is that we can test in our blood this AM cortisol or a couple other hormones around it. And it would help us to diagnose either too much cortisol, which is called Cushing's disease, or not enough cortisol, which is called Addison's disease. And you know if you have Addison's disease. I treated a few patients with it, and they essentially would like black out for hours on end because cortisol gives us energy. Like we need this cortisol to go about our lives. From the medical or allopathic standpoint, anything that sits between Cushing's and Addison's doesn't exist. But we all live in that in between, right?
Which is the general population.
Yeah, so that's like the naturopathic realm in there. So when we see a normal cortisol curve, and anyone with children, nieces, nephews have seen this before, maybe if we remember back to our childhood, that cortisol should do this huge spike first thing in the morning. It should be the thing that makes us be like, it's a beautiful day, let's hop out of bed full of energy, life is grand. Most of us don't have that anymore as adults, but the little kid waking up, jumping in their crib at 7 a.m. and you're going and being like, oh God, please go back to sleep. It's a big spike of cortisol first thing in the morning. That should slowly decrease so that at the end of the day, it's really low. And then melatonin, our sleeping hormone, kicks in and gives us a good night's sleep, right? So they wave back and forth and you feel rested and well. As we move through stress, as we move into the first phase, as we call it, of adrenal insufficiency, we tend to get too much cortisol production. So we get way too much in the morning. Instead of waking up at 7 a.m., let's say we're waking up at 5 a.m. and our brain's already going a million miles a minute. And we kind of do this with our cortisol throughout the day. For a lot of people earlier on, so especially in our kind of 20s-ish, it can feel really empowering. I look back to my mid-20s and I remember going to school full-time, working full-time. I literally remember a couple of days that I just drank coffee and I felt great. I was like, I am getting everything done. I am multitasking. I am amazing. And now I look back, I'm like, oh man, I totally fried my adrenals.
Yeah. Those were the days. We didn't know better.
Yeah, exactly. For some people, it presents on the flip and it actually creates a lot of anxiety throughout the day and overwhelm. But then our bodies can't deal with that high level of cortisol for a long time. So we move into the next pattern where we don't get enough cortisol anymore. And we hit the snooze button in the morning. We don't want to get out of bed. We can kind of rally, but we might need that cup of coffee or that tea first thing in the morning. Usually after lunch, we get this big crash, often around 3 to 5 o'clock, where we'd go for a siesta if we can, but usually we can't. So we have another coffee. We have some sweets to try and get through. And then we get into the evening and physically we're exhausted. There's like no way we're going to the gym, but we lay down in bed ready to go to sleep. And that's where our brain's like, oh no, we're going to dwell on that little thing that happened 6 months ago, or we're going to plan what we're going to eat next weekend. And you're like, why can't I go to sleep? And then it the whole curve again. And I see a lot of people in that phase nowadays. We call that the tired but wired phase.
Yeah, that's when I came to you. That's exactly the phase that I was in.
Totally.
And I was like, I can get up in the morning, kind of, if I can have a nap at 9 a.m.
Yeah. Yeah.
And then again at 3 p.m. Yeah. And then again at 7 p.m. And then I'm up until midnight.
Yeah, totally. And the interesting thing about that phase is, while everything overall feels a little bit more diminished because you're getting a little bit of cortisol in the morning, a little bit in the evening, you get this like double pump of cortisol versus the one big lift of it, is that we still tend to have a cortisol excess in that sort of picture. And then the very last one we call adrenal exhaustion, where your body will just give you a little bit of a cortisol and then nothing, and a little bit of nothing. Most people that come in there like slouched back in a chair, just being like, I'm exhausted all the time. And that's pretty far gone adrenal exhaustion that's happening, right? We don't want to get to that point. We can help somebody back to that point. I mean, you have to go a heck of a lot further to get to Addison's, but that's really kind of the spectrum of cortisol that we tend to. So yeah, that's a huge foundation, a huge piece that I think brings a lot of validation to people's symptoms. Because if we're feeling tired, often what we're reading or hearing from family, friends, our medical doctors, nurse practitioners, all that sort of stuff is like, well, you just got to exercise more. And you're like, how am I supposed to exercise when I am exhausted? And the only time that I'm productive really is like the morning. So that's the time that I'm going to like try and work and do things. But really it's this big interconnected web. And I really try and approach things like, yeah, sure, doing some exercise is important, but we got to get you some cortisol production and get that proper curve going so that you have the motivation, or else you're just going to have that idea of, I should be doing this, I should be doing that, is a further source of stress for something.
And I'm thinking about how many moms, I mean, you're in this state, especially as a mother, but how many moms out there really, live with this for probably until their teenage years, because this is just what being a mom in quotations is like.
Yeah,
this is just what being in your 30s and 40s is. This is just, the excuse that we have around the normalcy of things that are totally not normal. And I was speaking to somebody else a little while ago about this. We even have our family reiterating this around, what we see them when we were younger. They modeled to us this behavior. And so it's just normal for us. And so I'm really happy that we're talking about this, because it is not normal.
Not normal.
And you don't have to suffer through it.
Totally. Yeah. And I would say, like, unfortunately, in a way, it is normal, but it doesn't mean that normal is good either.
It's very common.
Yeah, it's very, very common at this point. And yeah, I've reflected with a lot of people, and maybe it is because these are my lenses, right? Like, I'm a business owner, I'm a doctor, I'm a mom, I'm very busy. I'm at the point that I don't want to be this busy anymore, but 'tis the cycle we're in. But how it's such a catch, I think, for us, and maybe a little bit with our previous generation. I think they were just on the cusp that, I certainly was raised with the, like, you're going to go to college, you're going to go to university. That's like, you got to work, you can do what you want. Like, it was very empowering and very like, go do it. But then we're caught in this, like, I got to do it. I got to succeed. I got to make money. I mean, we live in Vancouver. It's super expensive here. We got to, like, pay the bills. We can't carry debt, blah, 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 blah. And then you got to be a mom, and you got to be home to cook, and you got to go to field trips. And it's like, there's no way we can manage it all. And I think we're all going into motherhood, or most of us are going into motherhood in this state where societally we're like, oh, I worked 60 hours this week. And the next person's like, 60 hours. I worked 80 hours,
Yeah.
It's this race to the bottom. So we're already deficient.
Yeah.
And then we get more and more deficient, struggling with a year of not sleeping and breastfeeding and, momming. And then 18 years of that. And then at the end of it, you're like, who am I?
Who am I? And I'm retired. So doubling who am I? And it's so true. It's so true. It's really interesting to see how, especially with mothers, that this is just like, this is where you are. This is where you are.
Yeah, totally.
No?
Yeah.
We don't have to take that. We're not going to take it.
No, we're not going to take it. And traditionally we wouldn't, right? Like, we'd have a community that was around us. Like, I think of, how stories were told of, men would go to work all day, and you'd just be around all the other moms and all the other babies, and everyone be like picking up and supporting each other. And I mean, really at that time, I'm sure it was really stressful too back then, food insecurities, wars. Like, it's not like it was always a piece of cake back then by any means, but there was a different context to it, right? Life had a slower pace. You had one job. As women, we weren't working other than, taking care of everything to do in the household. But I mean, I'm so honored and privileged to get to have gone to medical school, to have, I have 12 years of education. Not everybody gets to do that. That's a huge, huge privilege to me. I have food security and home security and all that sort of stuff. And I would say that I'm feminist leaning, but man, there are days that I'm like, I would love to be at home and bake pies bare feet all day,
To which I would say still feminist, depending on what lens we can put on this,
It's true. Yeah.
The whole like hashtag trad wife, not here for that. No. And I will still bake you a pie in bare feet in the kitchen. Okay. Right. I still will. Totally. I also think back to, like, if we go back even further than this, women gathered in community, not just for the support of raising their children, but also we were the medicine women. We were the 100%. Medicine women that we spoke about these things, this big shift, really, to come in with a feminist perspective, and from a school, like, let me push my nerdy glasses up. Yeah, but around the Industrial Revolution, as things started to really change for us, we gave our power up of knowing these things. I think about women having even wet nurses,
Yeah.
or other women that came and supported them through their pregnancy, and how they gave birth. Like, we have gone way far back from that. And I think this swing of coming back into what we know, which is why I really wanted to speak to you, like, this whole bit is so empowering for me, because I finally feel seen and heard when
Yeah.
it comes to my health. And in the before times, as I like to call them, in the before times, we had this sort of support. We had women that would recognize us and say, "Oh, you're looking like this.
Yeah.
You may need this tincture, this herbal, added this herb to your supplement, or to your diet, excuse me, eating these greens, whatever it is." And during that time, during that Industrial Revolution, we just gave it all up. We just thought, not for me. No more. Somebody else will know better than I do.
Yeah, that's right. Just all the bearer of all the news. But it is an interesting piece in that, like, when people understand the cortisol curve, it's really empowering in line with their energy. And then when they understand how the cortisol is impacting their hormones, their estrogen and progesterone, like our sex hormones, as we generally call it, then they really can start to understand their cycle a little bit better. And I'm absolutely blown away at the number of women that I work with that are like I explain this stuff that I'm about to talk about to them, and they go like, why weren't we taught this in high school? Like, we get all the sex education, but essentially sex ed is more or less my understanding of it, at least. It's been years since I've done it, but I've done sex education.
Thanks for clarifying.
No. Okay.
Well fed over here, okay?
Sorry, honey. But anyway, so they're like basically taught in sex ed, like, don't get pregnant. Like, these are the things, but they're not told, like, this is what's happening when you have your period. This is what's happening when you ovulate, and that sort of piece. So this is something that I am teaching all the time that people find extremely empowering. And really, it's that we have these hormones, estrogen and progesterone are the main ones that dictate or govern our menstrual cycle. So when we look at a cycle, the textbooks will say to us, oh, our cycle should be 28 days long. You should have a 3 to 5 day bleed or period or menses at the start of it. We should ovulate bang on 14 days. And that's our cycle, right? Maybe a little discomfort's normal, that's that. But some people, their cycles are like 40 days long or 50 days long, or it's 50 days long and then it's 20 days long. And so the normal range, according to the textbooks, are basically 22 to 35 days, which is quite a bit of variety to them. But we have two phases within our menstrual cycles. Phase one, or the follicular phase, is estrogen dominant. So what happens is we get our period, that estrogen level starts to come up. And then right around when we ovulate, we get this big surge of hormone from our brain, or a pituitary gland in the brain, down to our ovaries that says, okay, let's do this. We're producing an egg. We're going to try and maybe get pregnant this month. Produces a huge surge of estrogen that comes up, and then it actually drops the next day after that. So that's kind of the end of the follicular phase. And then we shift into what we term the luteal phase after that, which is basically progesterone starts to come up. And progesterone comes up and it goes like, okay, are we pregnant now? And if you are, that progesterone continues to go up. And that's actually what maintains the pregnancy until a placenta forms. And the placenta then will take on the role of producing its own progesterone.
Wild.
It's so cool. If the body's like, okay, not pregnant this month, then the progesterone will drop. And where the progesterone drops and the estrogen comes up to start a next cycle, that's that crisscrossing is where it tells our body, okay, let's do this and have our next menstrual cycle.
Let's shed.
Yeah, exactly. Let's get rid of all that estrogen triggered endometrium that we really formed in the first 2 weeks of our cycle. So in that sense, we can start to tease out based on people's symptoms what may be going on. So things that may make me think, oh, this person's got a little bit too much estrogen in their system would be like they have really heavy periods. That makes me think, okay, the estrogen signaling that endometrium and that lining of the uterus for either too long or too intensely. If they have a lot of cramping or discomfort, that could be that same sort of piece. The body's like, oh, we got a lot of stuff to clear out this month. It's going to take some work, some cramping to get rid of it. I mean, that could also be fibroids, polyps, endometriosis, like other pieces, but all of those tend to be influenced heavily by estrogen. So we're tending to look at more of an estrogen dominance piece. Interestingly, is almost all the medical textbooks, and even when I went through school, which wasn't that long ago, 10-ish years ago, 10, 14 years ago, is that we were taught like every woman is essentially estrogen dominant, right? Oh, they've got painful periods, estrogen dominance. And I'm actually seeing a lot of women in practice through lab testing that are estrogen deficient now. We can get into that piece in a bit. And I think maybe one day we'll talk about more the infertility piece, which really has a big component in that.
Yeah.
So that's kind of the estrogen piece. But progesterone, it's interesting, linking back to the cortisol, when we look at the map of how our hormones are created, all of our hormones are created by or from cholesterol. So when they say cholesterol is bad, they're lying. You would die without it. I mean, some cholesterol, not great for us. Cholesterol carriers could get into that as well, but we won't. Anyway, cholesterol gets converted a bunch of times, goes to the centralized hormone called pregnenolone, and then it splits. And on one side, we get a split towards a hormone called DHEA, and then into testosterone, and then into estrogen. And I promise there's no test on any of this. But on the other side, we get progesterone, and then we get cortisol. So cortisol is there where it loops in on this big culprit of hormone dysregulation. Because very, very smartly, if cortisol is high, it takes us back to caveman days, right? I'm being chased by saber-toothed tigers. I'm going into a famine. This is not a safe time to be pregnant. So it actually steals from the progesterone, diminishing the progesterone to make the cortisol. So then if we remember back that progesterone should increase to maintain a pregnancy, it's going, not a sweet time to get pregnant right now. Let's make sure that doesn't happen so that we can survive, so that we can go on to have babies down the road, right?
You're literally blowing my mind right now.
Yeah. Isn't it crazy?
Like, it's crazy. It is wild. It is wilding. Like the things that happen in our body to live every day is incredible. It's so fascinating. And especially as women, like coming back to the thing that you said, we're only taught how not to get pregnant.
Totally. Yeah.
And if we are taught these things, how different, how much more empowered are we to go, oh, I think something's going on with my cycle. Or if I would have known this a long time ago, I would have known this is what's going on, why my progesterone might be low and maybe my cycle is a little bit shorter than it needs to be. It's because my stress hormone is just taking over.
Totally. Yeah.
I'm afraid to be eaten by a saber-toothed tiger right now.
Yeah. Yeah, exactly. That's totally it. And the really hard thing is that we could ask for lab testing, but our system here in Canada, and I mean, hallelujah for a free system, but it definitely has some challenges with it, is that they can run, let's say, a progesterone test on us, which ideally is done around day 21 of our cycle. But when we don't know exactly how long our cycle might be, we might not know where day 21 is. If we're on an IUD and we just get random spotting or don't even have a cycle, day 21 was maybe 2 years ago. But also, like, it's only showing what's floating around in our blood. And that's not how hormones work. You're like, yes, we can measure them in the blood, but a hormone has to actually go into the receptor site of a cell. The cell has to use it, and then it has to be metabolized out of our body. So we're not really getting the whole picture. And especially as women, we know our hormones change like potentially hour to hour. So getting a one-time snapshot doesn't tell us the whole picture, yet we could go in and get that done. And then it's like, oh, well, it looks fine. And it's like, well, does it? Like that only really has value if we're testing it every single day of the month and being able to map out how does this cycle actually look, right? So we're always looking to other clues. And that's where I find like hearing someone's experience is so good when they come in and they're like, I have really heavy cycles. I get some pain when I ovulate, and then I get really, really depressed and irritable in a couple of days before my cycle. And I mean, that's probably a pretty common story. Right away, I'm thinking that there's probably a little bit of progesterone deficiency and estrogen excess. And another really cool thing about progesterone is that it actually crosses the blood-brain barrier in our heads, obviously, and it converts into GABA, which is our calming neurotransmitter. So when we get a drop in progesterone, we don't get as much of that GABA production, which is where we start to feel more anxious and irritable and all that sort of stuff, because we don't have that calming element that's happening. And really, these hormones are on a teeter-totter with each other. It's like we could have totally fine estrogen levels, but it's when progesterone drops because cortisol is taking it that all of a sudden we do have a bit of an estrogen dominance. Or maybe it's that we've had such long-term cortisol. We've had a really stressful childhood and we've been in that fight or flight our whole life. It's like that whole side, that progesterone cortisol side, might have been pulling from estrogen for so long that we get a deficiency there and we're deficient in progesterone, or we get a relative imbalance this way. So there's really a lot more depth to it that we can look into. But I think that understanding of what our cycles are actually doing can really help us to start to tap into our hormones on a deeper level.
This is fascinating. This is
Yay.
the
I
things.
think it's cool.
Yeah. the things like knowledge, hashtag knowledge is power. But the things that when we learn about what our hormones are doing, when we know those things, we can really start to see, okay, now something's going on. It's not this that I have a heavy period. It's not just that my cycle is short or long for that matter, you know? And hearing today, I actually didn't know that 22 to 35 days could be the quote unquote average cycle or normal cycle. And that's wild to think about, you know, a 35 or a 22-day cycle still being in the range, because the only thing that is ever really hammered into us is 28 days.
Yeah, totally.
You've got day 14 is important, and day 28.
Yeah.
And
what's funny to jump in is like the misinformation around the apps that are there. I love that people have cycle tracking apps. I think it's so good to be able to keep in tune with your cycle and pick up on things that maybe you didn't notice necessarily. But especially, and I know we'll talk about fertility another day, but those apps are algorithmic. So they take your average cycle length and they minus 14 days off it and say, this is when you're ovulating. But it's not always that way. We don't perfectly ovulate on 14 days. It's going under the assumption, that textbook assumption, luteal phase is 14 days. So if you're 22 days long in your cycle, oh God, I'm going to have to do math now, then you would ovulate on day, this should be basic, 8 would be your ovulation, right? But if you got a 30-day cycle, then it's telling you that you're ovulating on day 16, right?
Right.
But maybe you've got a 30-day cycle and you actually ovulated on day 8. And I've seen patients that, you know, oh, we've been trying to get pregnant for a year. And then we go back through their tracker and they only had sex one time in actual alignment with when they were ovulating because their app was completely off. Right. So we have to be a little cautious with that information as well.
Wow. Just wow.
I would say, like, I mean, all of this knowledge in itself can be really empowering and helpful. And this is a time and place that, like, I always encourage people to do some of their own research. And when people come in and are like, I know I shouldn't Google, it's like, no, you shouldn't Google. Sure. Like, we've got all this education at our fingertips, but do it with a bit of a lens, or as we started talking about at the beginning, like work with that team-based system so that you can be like, this is my understanding, is this correct? And there's some really, really reputable sources out there, a lot of information, especially that are coming out of like Harvard and the Mayo Clinic, and these sort of things are like quite vetted pieces of information that they've made very user-friendly. But it's not always this blanket statement, right? And we're being bombarded in all of social aspects with like, this is the supplement for you, and this is this, and it's the
here's the 2-day cortisol cleanse.
Totally, that's exactly it.
Like, whoa, 2 days? You're gonna fix this?
Totally, yeah. And
I got a lifetime.
Totally. And that's the lens that I always remind people when they're working with me is we expect to see change with hormones when we are targeting change in about 3 months. It takes about 3 months to start to see those shifts. Sometimes within a month, people will start to be like, oh, it wasn't as painful, or oh, my cycle was lighter. Something will trigger them that it's improving. But I mean, for most of us nowadays, we've been under the influence of cortisol for a good portion of our lives, 20, 30 years. Taking a supplement for 1 month is not going to make a difference for that. It's certainly a start. I've seen changes within a couple months, but I like to be very realistic. This isn't a golden pill, and it's not like you take one thing and it's going to change everything. And for me, I'm a huge baby. I hate taking supplements. If I'm giving recommendations, it's always for the most therapeutic thing for the shortest amount of time. And often it's like a powder or a gummy or a liquid or something, because that's what I can take. So I do admit bias there. But I think there are things that we can do lifestyle wise and diet wise without saying like, okay, we're going to have to spend hundreds, if not thousands of dollars. And that's another rep that we get as naturopathic doctors. Oh, I went to a naturopathic doctor once and I spent $300 on a bunch of supplements. Not my jam. I know there's other naturopaths that work like that. That's not the way that I operate, or that's very few and far between when I do. But in terms of what we want to do to address hormones, this is where it's really great to meet with somebody and really start to identify, okay, what may be the imbalance here, right? And where can we be strategic in intervening with it rather than doing this catch-all sort of, this just balances your hormones. Because often we're only doing something for half your cycle. Maybe it's a progesterone deficiency, so we're only supporting that latter half of the cycle, and then the cortisol levels overall. Or maybe we just address the cortisol and let the hormones naturally come back to themselves. Or we look at something like seed cycling, which there's lots of stuff online. Seed cycling is really wonderful because it's food-based. It's general. It helps to balance your hormones overall. It can help you get in touch with your cycle. So that's a really great one that I encourage people to kind of dive into, whether it's under some guidance or just do on their own. It's really, really safe to do that one. But yeah, I'm always happy to nerd out with people on this sort of stuff. And I mean, it's wonderful with telemedicine, how that's become more and more of a thing. And my license is just for British Columbia, so I'm not able to work with anybody out of province or in the States, unfortunately, but I've known lots of people. We're not a huge community. So if you are somewhere else and if anyone ever wants to reach out through website or anything, I'm happy to give referrals or, to other practitioners throughout North America. But yeah, if somebody's in BC and wants to connect by telemedicine or in person, I'm here in Vancouver or up in Powell River on the Sunshine Coast as well in person. So reach out on Instagram, website, all those sort of things.
Yeah.
I'm happy to support people however I can, even if it's not in a full-on visit. I can give general ideas. And then certainly if you're a patient, I can give more specific guidelines for things.
This is wonderful. This has been so great talking to you.
Yeah,
I've
I'm
loved
so happy to get to nerd out about this stuff.
Yeah, I love talking about this subject. I love that I already feel the connection happening for women out there that are listening to this, because it's going to be great. And I am here to also vet. I have absolutely loved working with you, Dr. Robyn. I've been somebody who has come in and checked Dr. Google, and you've been like, yes, and that's felt so different than kind of meekly saying to a GP, like, oh, I kind of looked this up online, and it completely being dismissed. So that's also part of the partnership that I feel with you.
Thank you. I'm
So
so honored to get to work with you.
Oh, thanks so much. Thanks so much for coming on the podcast today. We absolutely loved you. I am going to put your Instagram and your website down in the show notes for anybody that wants to reach out to you.
Thank you.
Thanks so much.